Shalom and good evening, everyone. What we're going to do in the next hour is look at several works of medieval Christian art and try to use them to gain insight into the medieval Christian idea of Jews, or medieval Christian ideas of Jews and Judaism. I would just preface our little venture by saying that this is a vast and complicated topic, and there is no attempt or presumption here to be complete or comprehensive in any way whatsoever. Quite the opposite. We're going to be very selective, but I hope that in so doing we can get a feeling of how Jews and Judaism were imagined or constructed in the medieval Christian imagination. And even though the Jews we're going to see in the works of art that I'm going to begin showing you in just a minute, even though these Jews were not real Jews as such, nevertheless, the way in which they were imagined and constructed did have a very direct and vast effect on the ways in which Jews and Christians interacted in the Middle Ages and even beyond. So here's the first picture. We will get to the picture itself in just a minute. But first we have to equip ourselves with a little bit of historical background that concerned two individuals who were extremely important in the history of Western Christianity. The first in the history of Christianity in general. The first perhaps was, more than any other single individual, the founder of Christianity as we now know it. And this individual was Paul, a Jew who was apparently born, given the name Saul upon his birth, who experienced what he believed was a revelation from Jesus as he was traveling on the proverbial road to Damascus in the middle of the first Christian century. He was appointed in that revelation, in that vision that he had, by Jesus to become Jesus's apostle and spread the word of God and Jesus, and draw people invite people to join the new covenant of grace that in Christian tradition was begun by the crucified Jesus. And Paul then embarked upon a missionary career, both in the land of Israel and in various places throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world, in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and in Greece. And in one place, in one stop along his route, a place called Galatia in modern-day Turkey, Paul preached to a group of people who were interested in converting to a certain kind of Judaism. Evidently, they were, you could say, shopping around a bit for the Judaism that they were going to adopt as their own. Paul preached to them, developed a relationship with them, then left, but eventually corresponded with them in the wake of a visit to their community by other Christian missionaries who had different ideas than Paul as to what conversion to the new covenant of Jesus, as to what this conversion actually entailed. Those other Christian emissaries seem to have been preaching that in order to become a Christian, one needed to become a Jew, a practicing Jew, a law-abiding Jew first. And Paul responded in a letter, an epistle, which is now in the canon of the New Testament, his epistle to the Galatians, that they needn't do that, that observing the law of Moses was not something incumbent upon them, Paul then tries to define what it means to be a Christian in the sense that he is that he is trying to nurture among them. He has to explain what one's identity as a member of this new covenantal community would be like. And as so often happens in human relationships, in order to define one's own identity, one needs an other to contrast oneself with. We find that in so many different contexts, whether it's a racial other, an ethnic other, a gendered other, a sexual orientation kind of other. One, perhaps unfortunately, but one typically expresses who one is on the basis of who one is not. And the other for Paul in Paul's epistle to the Galatians, in his letter to this community of prospective converts, the other is the law-abiding Jew. And Paul explains in a kind of parabolic sermon that Abraham, the founding father of God's covenant with the people of Israel, the founding father of the Israelite community with whom God had struck a covenant, that Abraham had two wives. One was a free woman, Sarah. The other was a slave woman, Hagar. Each one bore him a son. Sarah bore him Isaac. Hagar bore him Ishmael. Ishmael, like his mother, was not free. And Paul uses Sarah and Isaac on the one hand, Hagar and Ishmael on the other hand, as an allegory that would shed light on the relationship between the new covenant of Jesus, which we then come to call Christianity, and law-abiding Judaism, Judaism that is based on the observance of the law of Moses, the mitzvot, the commandments in the Torah. And Paul says that Abraham's two wives and two sons are an allegory that enable us to compare the two covenants. His Christian covenant is a covenant of freedom. The covenant based on observance of the law is a covenant of slavery. One is a covenant that is heavenly, that is spiritual. The other is a covenant that is earthly, that is material, that is bodily. We won't belabor the point, but the bottom line is that Paul presents Jews and Judaism as the other, in contrast to which and to whom people who will join the new covenant of Jesus as Christians can contrast and thereby identify themselves. And this begins a tendency in classical Christian teaching, which never really goes away, that in the Western tradition, among the church fathers, among the important theologians who wrote and preached in Latin during the first several Christian centuries, that we call adversus Judaios, against the Jews. Christian preachers, Christian theologians typically come to define what it means to be Christian, typically come to try and validate the teachings of Christianity, the claims of Christian theology concerning God, Jesus, and the people of Israel by negating the ideas of the Jews. Christians will assert their own understanding of Hebrew scripture that Christians call the Old Testament by negating the Jews' understanding of the Old Testament. The Jews then become the quintessential other for classical Christian theologians, going all the way back to Paul. But in being that other, they serve a purpose, because Christian theologians, even in the absence of Jews, will often convey their theological lessons to Christian or non-Christian audiences in sermons, in treatises directed against the Jews and Judaism, adversus Judaios. And this carries forth into the Middle Ages and is something we happen to remember. From Paul, we move briefly to touch upon the most important of the church fathers, the founding fathers of the Western Roman Catholic theological tradition in late ancient times, Augustine of Hippo. Hippo was a small town in northeastern Algeria of today. Augustine was born probably in 354, and he died around the year 430. And in his massive corpus of writings, in fact, there was one of the later church fathers after Augustine who said that anybody who claims to have read everything Augustine wrote is a liar. That may well be the case, but in the massive corpus of his writings, Augustine formulates what should be the stance and proper posture of Christianity, of the Catholic Church, towards the Jews and Judaism living in the Christian world. And Augustine found a verse in Psalm 59, in the Catholic tradition it's actually Psalm 58, in which the psalmist says that God has shown him God's enemies, and then God says to the psalmist how one should relate to these enemies, and uses the words, "Slay them not, lest my people forget." And Augustine maintained that God was speaking to the Christian church about the Jews, that they should not, they could not be destroyed. They and their Judaism had to be preserved because they served a purpose in a properly ordered Christian world. And this purpose Augustine compared to the role of a witness who offers testimony. Christianity was hard-pressed at times in Augustine's day to authenticate itself as a genuine religion. Why? Because it was a relatively new religion. And the one thing, perhaps more than anything else, that a religion didn't want to be in ancient times was new. Because religions claim to deal in eternal truths. A new religion, with its new eternal truths, has truths that have not been around all the time. It's a recent invention. In fact, in church Latin of the Middle Ages, one of the most cardinal sins that a theologian could commit was called innovatio, innovation. You can't devise a new belief. And Augustine maintained that the books of the Jews in the Hebrew Bible contain everything a Christian needs to know and believe. Just the Jews don't understand them right. Christians do understand their true meaning, but we need the Jews and Judaism around in order to validate where those Christian beliefs come from. The Jews and their books testify, Augustine maintained, to the biblical roots of Christianity. Even though the Jews are blind to the truths of those books, they nevertheless serve as these witnesses. And that's why the Jews cannot be eliminated or removed or prevented from practicing Judaism in a properly ordered Christian world, prevented from observing the commandments of the law of Moses, Augustine maintained, because we need them around in order to serve as this other, in contrast to which we can show that we are right and they are wrong. And one of the ways in which we show that we are right and they are wrong, Augustine maintained, comes in the second half of this same verse in Psalm 59, and that is, "Slay them not, lest my people forget, but scatter them by your might, bring them down." The Jews have to be dispersed, in exile, subjugated, subordinated, in a way enslaved. And that way, everybody looking at the Jew on the one hand and the Christian on the other hand will be reinforced in the conclusion that Christianity has replaced or superseded Judaism as the authentic expression of God's covenant with the people of Israel. All this in the background then. And now we turn to our picture that comes from a work of ivory, an exquisite work of ivory from the year 900, perhaps a little beforehand, that if we ever get back traveling again, you can go see in the original in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I think the original might even be smaller than the picture that you're looking at on your screen, but it is far more impressive. The detail is exquisite. It's not black or white or gray. It's a kind of orangey gold in its present condition. Well worth a trip to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And what are we looking at? What are we looking at in this piece of art? We are looking at a representation of the crucifixion of Jesus, which for Christianity occurs at the most important moment in all of human history. The moment when Jesus is killed on the cross. Christianity teaches that his death was a sacrifice to atone for human sin. This is the moment that separates old from new, Old Testament from New Testament. In Christian theology, that whether we say BC or BCE has in Christian chronology, whether we say BC or BCE, it's the same. It separates before from after. This is the central, most critically important moment in all of human history, in the history of God's plan to bring humanity to salvation in Christian teaching. And we can see how this is a kind of three-tiered or three-storied representation. There are the angels in heaven who are perhaps celebrating the inauguration of the new covenant or preparing to welcome Jesus back into heaven, where he goes to rejoin his Father, according to Christian teaching, 40 days after the crucifixion. The lower story shows us the gates of hell being broken open as a result of the liberating effects of Jesus's death. But actually, we are concerned with the middle story, the middle floor of this three-tiered representation. And we're going to ask about this one, what we're going to ask about each one of the four works of art that I will show you. And that is, what is the function of Jews and or Judaism in these works of art? That has to be our guiding question. Otherwise, we could talk forever about any one of them. And in this particular representation, Jesus himself was a Jew, but the artist didn't think of him as such. There are really no Jews worth our focusing on at the moment. But what we are interested in are these two women underneath Jesus's outstretched arm. Underneath Jesus's left arm, and perhaps anybody who studied Latin once upon a time will remember that the Latin word for left is sinister. The left side is not the good side in most religious traditions, neither in Jewish mysticism. It's the other side, the bad side, as it were. Under Jesus's outstretched left arm, to our right, is a woman named Synagoga, like synagogue. She is the embodiment, the representation of the Jewish people, or more precisely of what for Christianity is the Old Covenant, the covenant of the law, the covenant of the slave woman, Hagar, and her son, Ishmael, the covenant of earthly observance of the law. And under Jesus's right arm is another woman, this one, who is ministering to Jesus's wounds, and she is ecclesia, right? Synagoga and ecclesia. And it's this pair of women that we're interested in. They almost never appear apart in crucifixion scenes during the early Middle Ages. They almost invariably appear as a pair. And synagoga, to our right, Jesus' left, embodies Judaism. What's her role in this picture? What is she doing here? Why at the most important Christian moment does the artist include synagoga, or the embodiment of the people of Israel, as it were, the people of the covenant of the law that has, according to Christian teaching, been replaced by Christianity? So I think we can get a sense of what she's doing here if we, for a moment, and our medieval predecessors didn't have the luxury of doing what I'm going to do now, if we eliminate these women from the picture for a moment. We'll put them back in a second, and then we can understand a little better what their contribution is and what synagoga's contribution is to this work of art. Without synagoga and ecclesia, we have a frontal view of the crucified Jesus. We have a kind of split-second photo of the most important fraction of a second in all of human history. This is that critical moment which we described just a moment ago. There isn't any motion in time that this work of art portrays in its present form. But if we put synagoga and ecclesia back into the picture, we can see that they add something that is very interesting and instructive. Let's look at how the two of these women, and we're interested here primarily in synagoga, let's look at how they are represented. Eventually, in medieval art, synagoga will become blindfolded and represented in a more demeaning fashion than she is here. But what's important for us right now is that she is facing off stage, right? She's prepared to make her exit, right? Her body is turned away from the crucified Jesus. And Jesus is not looking down at her. He is looking down at ecclesia, at Holy Mother Church, at the embodiment of the new covenant of Christianity. But synagoga then is preparing to leave. What does she do on her way out? She makes a critical gesture of looking over her shoulder on her way out of town. And in so doing, I believe that she cannot but remind us of a biblical predecessor of hers who also looked over her shoulder on her way out of town. Lot's wife, on her way out of the city of Sodom, moments before its destruction. And as a result, the Bible tells us she was turned into a pillar of stone, which in terms of the geology of the Judean desert really means that she turned into rock. She was petrified. She was doomed to stand there forever. Synagoga is on her way out. The New Testament, ecclesia, Holy Mother Church, has replaced her. But she looks back, and then she too is petrified. She's stuck. She can't move. She's frozen. And she's necessary. She has a place underneath the arms of the outstretched Jesus on the cross, albeit the sinister arm, but nonetheless, she needs to be there. Why? Why does she need to be there? Because these two women give to this work of art, not just a vertical axis along these three stories of heaven, earth, and hell, but in a certain kind of way. I don't think you have to stretch the imagination too far to see that they give this picture a horizontal axis, because they give motion in time. They give a historical dynamic to this representation. Synagoga's on her way out. Ecclesia, the New Testament, Christianity, is on her way in. There's motion here. It's as close as this artist could come to a video installation. But it has a similar effect because there's historic dynamic. Before the crucifixion, there was synagoga. And before Jesus was crucified, he would have looked down on her as the bearer of his covenant. But now on the cross, at the moment of the crucifixion, she's been replaced. She's on her way out. She has come in. Holy Mother Church has come in to replace her. She collects the blood of the crucified Christ, which will become the basis for dispensing salvation in the new church. Jesus is looking down at her, but she can't leave because Christianity needs her to show where Christianity came from. That Christianity has its roots in the religion of biblical Israel, in the books of biblical Israel. And therefore, synagoga, who represents these, must stay. One early medieval Christian writer called the Jews, along these lines, living letters of the law. They're a kind of embodiment of Hebrew scripture, and that's why we need them around in our midst. And this idea hasn't gone away. Before I moved to Israel some 30 plus years ago, I taught at the State University in Columbus, Ohio, but I also gave a course at a Methodist theological school on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. And it was a course that didn't have anything to do with this work of art that you're looking at. It was about modern Jewish history. But nevertheless, when I would sit with the dean and the president of this Methodist seminary, on a number of occasions, not one of those occasions passed without them telling me how important it was to have me in their midst. I needed to be there. Because without Jews and Judaism, this picture is not complete. One of the most important popes of the early Middle Ages, who was pope around the year 600, named Gregory the First or Gregory the Great, in a very frequently quoted sermon, said that religious art is a kind of textbook for the illiterate. Most people back then couldn't read or write, but most people could see. And most people like to look at works of art, good pictures, before they're going to focus on complicated theological sermons. I know I'm like that. And so you can teach theology by looking at iconography, by looking at religious art. And here is a very small piece of art, a miniature, which conveys so much that is essential to Christianity's self-understanding of where it came from and what it is leaving behind that nevertheless still has a place on a Christian map of the world. So much of Augustine's idea of slay them not, lest my people forget, but scatter them by your might, bring them down, enslave them, is expressed in contrasts between synagoga and ecclesia like this one. But you've got to think of her in order to get the point, I believe, as you would imagine Lot's wife, stuck, frozen. She's got nowhere to go. because history's moved on without her. The history of salvation has moved on without her. So this is the first of our 4 pictures. The second one brings us into the second half of the Middle Ages, into the 13th century, into a collection of Christian prayers from Germany, an illuminated manuscript, which contains this illustration of the scourging or the flagellation of Jesus. The New Testament tells the story of how after Jesus was arrested and brought to Pontius Pilate, according to the narrative of the 4 Gospels, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, did not want to crucify Jesus. He wanted to release him. The Jews were clamoring for his crucifixion. And Pontius Pilate, according to the narrative of the New Testament, hopes he can buy off the Jews by having Jesus scourged. And if any of you ever saw Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, perhaps you recall the horrific scene of the scourging, the flagellation of Jesus. A scene that in the movie goes on for 12 minutes of Jesus being whipped. But who is whipping him? Both in the New Testament narrative and also in Mel Gibson's movie. Mel Gibson's movie is faithful to the New Testament narrative by portraying Roman soldiers as scourging Jesus. But who is scourging Jesus here? Jews. They might be wearing short tunics, as Roman soldiers might have worn, but you can tell that they're Jewish by their hats, by their facial hair, and yes, by their noses, which have already become an uncomplimentary ethnic stereotype in medieval art. Here, the Jews are scourging Jesus, even though the biblical narrative, the New Testament narrative, presents the Romans as scourging Jesus. Did our artist or the person who commissioned this work of art not know his scripture? Did he make a mistake? Did he forget that it's the Romans who scourged Jesus? I don't think so. I think that what happened by now is, first of all, long before the 13th century, the Christian church and the Roman Empire, as it were, got married. The Romans weren't bad guys anymore. But what's more instructive in this particular work, which doesn't want to malign the Romans, is that the Jews are represented as emblematic of hostility towards Jesus, and by extension, hostility towards Christians, Christianity, the church. There's almost an equation being drawn. Hatred, hostility towards Jesus is something we identify with the Jews. And these Jews are very, very different from synagoga that we saw in the previous work, right? In the 9th century. We've moved ahead 350 years or so, and now the artist is not, at least in this work, is not interested in synagoga, is not interested in Judaism. He's interested in Jews as expressive of hostility towards Jesus and Christianity, Christians and Christianity. What's happened in the meantime is, not long before this picture was created, what's happened is that the Christian world has begun to wake up to the fact that Judaism is not petrified in the way that it's represented, in the way that synagogue was represented in the early Middle Ages. Judaism isn't stuck back in antiquity. It's not frozen, as Augustine taught that it was. But rather, Judaism continues to develop in a way that Augustine never imagined it could, would, or should. Jews of the Middle Ages, who were rabbinic Jews, Talmudic Jews, halachic Jews, not Jews of the Old Testament, those Jews, Augustine, or so Augustine was understood to have taught, were not real Jews. They might tell you, Jews of the 13th century, that their Judaism was authentic Judaism, but it doesn't correspond to the Judaism that Augustine portrayed as petrified under the outstretched arm of the crucified Jesus. And Augustine, who had become the foremost theological authority in the medieval Christian world, the medieval European Christian world, a theology professor in 1250 walks into class and says, Augustine taught this, but he's wrong. Not only would he lose his tenure, but he'd probably find himself burned at the stake the next day. You couldn't disagree with Augustine. And therefore, Augustine knew what real Judaism was. Jews who had developed Judaism into a different rabbinic Talmudic religion that the church has just recently now awakened to, they're not real Jews. They're not doing what Jews are meant to do in a Christian world. Instead of contributing to the proper world order in Christendom, they are subverting it. And they are represented then as expressing hostility towards Christianity, towards Christians, towards Jesus, to the extent that even the hostility of the Roman soldiers scourging Jesus in the passion narratives of the Gospels is now transferred onto these medieval Jews, right? Medieval, very much contemporary Jews in the way that they are portrayed. Our third picture takes us to the end of the 14th century, to a book of hours, or a kind of Christian Sidur Tfilah, right? A prayer book containing the different prayers that you say at different parts of the day, hence the term, Book of Hours. And in a very ornately illuminated letter, you know how the first letters or words of chapters, even in modern books, are often large and ornate and decorated. In the Middle Ages, typically even more so in medieval manuscripts. In one large illuminated letter, we find this illustration, this illumination, which depicts a well-known medieval Christian folktale that has been attested, that has survived in between 50 or 60 different sources, and that's a lot by medieval standards. 3 or 4 might be a good number. Here we have 50 or 60 different sources that contain this folktale of, he's often called the Jewish boy. And I'll just take a minute to share the story with you. The story goes something like this. There's a Jewish boy who has Christian friends, and he likes to play with them in the way that little boys like to play out in the street. And then one day, the Jewish boy finds himself abandoned. Why? Because the Christian boys, his friends, have been told by their parents that it's time for them to go to Mass. It's time for them to go to church, and they all have to go. And our little Jewish boy is about to be left by himself in the street. But his Christian friends have pity on him. They feel for him. They don't want him to be left out. And so they invite him to come along. And they tell him he'll have a great time. There are nice people there. There's a nice man, an older man, who'll give him a cracker and a cookie if he does what he's supposed to do. There are nice windows on the wall that are well illustrated. Come along with us. And he does. And here he is, right? Together with his friends. But here's our Jewish boy who is receiving communion, right? He's receiving the host of the Eucharist, the sacrament of the Mass, from the priest. And this essentially renders him a convert to Christianity. And that isn't simply my interpretation. It's confirmed by the appearance of this majestic-looking woman in the background, who is none other than the Virgin Mary herself, who is, in the Catholic tradition, the patron saint of neophytes, of new converts to Christianity. And she's here because this Jewish boy, in taking the sacrament, in receiving communion, has just become a part of the new Christian covenant. And then our little Jewish boy goes home. And his parents ask him, "So, what did you do today?" And as all you parents know, what this little boy should have said was, "Oh, nothing." But he didn't. He was so excited and so enthusiastic about the experience that he had, and he recounted it in great detail, that his father, instead of simply sitting him down or taking him for a walk in the woods or giving him a mild slap on the hand and saying, "We don't do that kind of thing," his father picked him up and threw him into the oven. As the rest of the people in his family watch on, observe. But the story doesn't end there, because the Virgin Mary has a sense that she needs to look out for this neophyte, for this fresh convert to Christianity, and she follows him home. And she has a sense that there's foul play going on inside, so she calls the police. They break down the door. They open up the oven. They pull out our little boy, who miraculously has been unscathed. He's whole, he's unharmed. A true, veritable miracle. Here we have, I said, between 50 and 60 versions of the stories. According to a great many of them, according to all of them, what happens to the father is that he gets thrown into the oven instead and burns to a crisp immediately. The other people in his family, according to some versions, get thrown into the oven as well. According to other versions, having seen the miraculous salvation of this little boy, they too follow the boy and convert to Christianity. But again, what's our question? What's the role, what's the purpose of Jews in this work of art? Who are they? What do they look like? What kind of messages do they convey? This is the late 14th century. The first ritual murder accusations against the Jews in medieval Europe were leveled against Jews, against Jewish communities in the 12th century, over 200 years before this. Blood libels begin in the 13th century. Blood libels are a kind of ritual murder accusation, a kind of libel against the Jews, that the Jews need to kill Christians and shed their blood, but the blood libel takes it one step further, from ritual murder to ritual cannibalism. Not only, according to the accusations leveled against the Jews, did they commit murder of innocent Christians, but they use their blood. They ingest their blood in the dough for matzot, for Pesach, perhaps in medicines. But ritual murder becomes, in the blood libel, ritual cannibalism as well. And so this is the age in which these and other libels against the Jews are very well known in medieval Europe. And perhaps the message or the scene being represented in this work of art has a subtext. And the subtext goes something like this. If this is what the Jews will do to their own children, you all can fill in the rest of the sentence, right? Just imagine what they're going to do to our children. And look at the faces of these Jews. It's more than just facial hair and a big nose, but it's monstrosity. It's almost an inhuman face. The Jew is being dehumanized in medieval Christian art. The Jew is being progressively more demonized in the iconography of the Middle Ages, not in every single work of art, not across the board, but one can see a developing trend that perhaps reaches a kind of climax in this iconographic motif, this motif of late medieval Christian art, which appears in dozens of instances, both in the Middle Ages and also in early modern times and not so early modern times as well. This motif is called the Judensau, German for the Jews' sow. Right here is a female pig. Here is a female pig. And you know that she is a female pig, a sow, because Jews are sucking at her udders, her teats. They are nursing from her. Right? And how do you know they're Jews? Because they're wearing their Jewish hats. And they have Jewish facial hair. And it's not just one Jew here who's doing it, but it's a whole group of Jews, right? Some are going at the sow in order to suck at her milk. This Jew right here, his hat's fallen off his head, but it started there on his head, right? This Jew is behind the sow, pulling up her tail so that the sow's excrement will fall into the mouth of another Jew who is lying here right beneath the sow. And here, mounting her from the rear in a kind of bestial, sexual sort of way, are other Jews. Every perversity, every demonic horror imaginable is projected onto Jews in a way that has nothing to do with real Jews and Judaism anymore. Jews back then didn't have anything to do with pigs. They didn't raise them. They didn't come near them. They didn't eat them for sure. And here, they're doing all these terrible things with the sow. This is where the Jew, or how the Jew, comes to develop in various trajectories of the medieval Christian imagination. Very different from what we saw back in the 9th century, where Jews and Judaism have a place, maybe not a complementary one, but petrified though they are, they belong here in this picture. This picture, this Judensaal, was sculpted into a column in the Cathedral of Uppsala, Sweden, in the middle of the 1300s. And Uppsala was the capital of Christian Sweden in the later Middle Ages. This Judensaal is not tucked away in some far nook or cranny where nobody would see it, but it's right there for all to gaze at. This is the message that is being transmitted then to gazers, to viewers on this work of art, when they would come to worship at the cathedral in Uppsala. You all know the saying, old myths die hard. People don't really know or think about Judensaals anymore. And most Jews and most Christians don't know anything about synagoga and ecclesia in early medieval iconography anymore. And even if they would go to Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, they'd see the Romans scourging Jesus and not Jews. But images like these still have an effect on a collective mentality. Their meaning, their context, their background might be forgotten, might recede into the background. But as the Middle Ages give way to modernity, and we begin to talk and think about things like anti-Semitism, then I think one has to understand that anti-Semitism as such in its modern guise is not Christian as such, but still is nourished by the Western traditions which developed over the previous 1500, 1600, 2000 years. Some of them we've looked at together this evening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. There is, I think she's also a professor, Eva Frajmovic. I hope I didn't destroy your last name. She sent some links to the images online in color.
Great.
So there's that one. And then there's this too. And she had a very
Thank you, Eva.
good question. I once came across a 13th century Psalter, I think it's pronounced, in which St. Peter had given a pallium cornutum, I'm sorry, I don't know Latin, which was quickly corrected away before completion. To what degree do you think control was exercised from above, apropos your image too?
That is a very thorny issue that I think you know a lot more about than I do, Eva. In fact, Doron, if there's any way to open up her microphone, maybe Eva would like to comment on that.
Find her. Yes, Eva can open your microphone and your camera if you'd like.
Oh, amazing. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but not see you.
Oh, sorry, I haven't got a webcam on this computer yet.
So I'll have to remember what you looked like years ago when we met.
Same, nothing changed. Thank you very much. That was an amazing, you know, it's so amazing how much you can get out of just 3 images. That is so fascinating. Thank you so much for your talk. Nothing. I just wanted to share that this funny moment when I came across one of these psalters from the 13th century, and it had a fairly standard kind of cycle of the Passion sequence, and but something had peeled off. The paint had peeled off, and so I could suddenly see that Peter had initially been given this Jew's hat, the pointy hat,
Right.
and then so this was the underdrawing, and then the painting clearly corrected this. So I'm not trying to question in any way anything that you said. I'm just sometimes sort of puzzled, to what degree painters could sometimes get away with things that were not perhaps strictly Orthodox or Catholic, I should say.
Well, for everybody who isn't familiar with her, Eva is one of the leading art historians in Europe today who deals with this medieval Christian iconography of Jews and Judaism. And I'm not an art historian at all. So I just read what people like her have to say and learn a lot from their studies. I'm aware that this is a very tricky and thorny issue of control and who actually is responsible for the imagery that we see in a particular work of art. And what you found here in that Psalter is a good example of how there might be tensions lurking in the background of any particular representation. That's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, professors. Hannah had a question. Is the story a milder version of the kidnapping of Jewish children to convert them to church? I'm assuming she's talking about the second, or the third.
Is that story of the Jewish boy related to kidnapping stories? Not insofar as the folktale goes. That little Jewish boy is depicted as a very willing, enthusiastic convert. He doesn't know much about theology, but I think that in terms of the way in which the folktale would have been received, the purity of his young soul would speak for itself in Christian terms, in its attraction to Christianity.
Thank you very much. There are actually many more questions and a great deal of compliments and thank yous. I'll be sure to send you the manuscript of the chat, but we do have time for one more question. So what does all this have to do with modern anti-Semitism?
Well, since I had a little extra time, I sort of touched on that question already. And I think, just to reiterate, that in searching for the roots of European anti-Semitism that nurtured Nazism and the Holocaust, historians have sometimes pointed a finger at Christianity. And I think that to do that is too simplistic and not appreciative of the complexity of the issue. Anti-Semitism as such is a modern phenomenon, but nevertheless, it's a phenomenon that develops in Christian Europe, and that context and the cultural background and the inculcation of traditions over hundreds of years that fashion a particular mentality concerning Jews and Judaism cannot be overlooked. So that many of the motifs, phrases, characterizations, caricatures that we find concerning Jews and Judaism and the Middle Ages are redeployed out of their medieval context in a modern context where the Christian theology isn't necessarily there, even if the Christian theology had a part in nurturing those symbols and motifs and ways of thinking about the Jews.
Thank you very, very much. I just put a link to a survey that we're doing in Hebrew in the chat. If any of you have a little time, we'd appreciate hearing about our content. I'm putting...
We lost you, Doron.
Hi, I'm sorry. I just put in the chat room a link to a survey in Hebrew. If anyone has the time, we'd appreciate filling out. It takes only a couple of minutes. I also put in just now the link to our website where you can see future events and sign up to them and see past events that we've recorded. This event too will be there within 2 to 3 days, hopefully. And I'm now opening your microphones so you may thank the professor yourselves. We'll see you in the next event. Thank you very much and have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Good night.
Just grieves me so much as what has happened in the past. It grieves me so much. I'm sorry on behalf of those who are Christians.
Thank you.
Makes me so sad. Yeah.
We learned almost nothing about Jewish history in the European tradition and culture. However, I'm a lawyer and I learned law history too, but we ignored during my studies these respects.
Thank you. Where are you from?
I am from Hungary.
Okay. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm also pleased to be here.
Okay, so have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared.
Very much. It was wonderful to hear.
Good night.
Good night.
Yes,
from
thank you very much.
It's a pity they don't teach us in school such things.
Well,
Really interesting.
thanks.
Yes, very informative. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.